It started with a simple knock on my door, sharp and loud, like it was meant to intimidate. I opened it, expecting maybe a neighbor needing help or a package left at the wrong house. Instead, I found a letter, no envelope, no name, just a thickly folded sheet of paper shoved into my hand by a security guard wearing a crisp HOA badge. He didn't say a word, just handed it to me and walked away without even looking up. That was the first sign something was wrong. The letter was typed in bold capital letters. It wasn't friendly. It stated that, as of that morning, my family members were prohibited from entering the community without prior approval from the HOA board. No exceptions. It cited a list of vague infractions. One was noise complaints. Another was something called vehicle overpresence, which apparently meant too many cars parked during my family gatherings. The last one just read, general disruption. 2. Neighborhood harmony. I stared at the paper for a long time. My father, who had been sitting in the kitchen, sipping his usual morning tea, walked over to see what had me frozen in place. I handed him the letter. He read it once, then again, his eyes narrowed. So they think they can ban our family, he said quietly. I nodded. My father has always been a calm man. Calculated, he doesn't raise his voice often. But that morning, something shifted in his face. A steeliness I hadn't seen in years returned. You see, my father wasn't just any senior in retirement. He was once a respected federal judge, and even after he stepped down from the bench, his influence remained strong in the state. He folded the letter carefully, put it back on the counter, and said, "We'll attend the next HOA meeting. All of us." In the days that followed, the situation escalated. My sister came by to drop off a birthday cake for my son. She wasn't even on the property for 10 minutes before a patrol car from the HOA security team blocked her in. She was asked to step out of the vehicle. They made her show ID. They treated her like a trespasser. She left in tears. My father watched from our front window, eyes cold, hands folded behind his back. The day of the HOA meeting arrived. It was held at the community center, a modern building with glass walls and high ceilings meant to give a sense of transparency and openness. The irony wasn't lost on us. My father wore his old black suit, the one he kept reserved for important occasions. When we entered the hall, the chatter died down. The board members looked up and stiffened. They didn't expect him. The president of the HOA, a man named Ronald Spears, tried to keep the mood light. "Judge Allen, we weren't expecting you," he said, standing up and offering a handshake, but my father ignored the gesture. "I'm here because you crossed a line," he said, voice low but full of quiet force. The room fell silent. He walked to the center of the room and turned to face the attendees. Most of them were our neighbors. Some looked away, others stared at their laps. A few nodded in solidarity. "You sent a letter banning my family," my father began, "without due process. Without any opportunity for us to respond or defend ourselves. You made up infractions that aren't part of any formal community guidelines. You allowed a security officer to harass my daughter, and now, I'm going to respond." Ronald shifted in his seat. "With respect, Judge, we were only acting to preserve the peace and maintain community standards." My father turned to him. "Whose peace? Whose standards? Because the way I see it, you're running a private club, not a neighborhood association." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. My father continued. "Let me explain what's going to happen. First, you will immediately rescind the ban you placed on my family. You will issue a written apology to each member affected. And third, you will suspend all current enforcement actions pending a full review of your practices by the County Oversight Board." Rano stood. "You can't dictate terms here. This is a private meeting." My father smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, Mr. Spears, I can. You see, I may be retired, but I still serve as legal advisor to the County Development Commission. I helped write the regulations your HOA operates under, and you've broken several of them." There was silence. Then, a few gasps. One woman in the back even clapped before catching herself. "You've used your position to intimidate, control, and exclude," my father said. "That ends now, because as of this morning, I've filed a motion with the County Council to revoke your HOA's charter, and pending that review, all HOA authority is hereby suspended." Chaos broke out. Ronald turned pale. Board members whispered furiously among themselves. My father stood calmly through it all. We left the meeting with every eye in the room on us. Some were angry, but more were grateful. That night, neighbors who had never spoken much waved and smiled. One even brought over a pie. The letter was gone from our mailbox the next morning. No apology yet, but silence where once there was threat. But my father wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, he began gathering stories from other residents. People who had been fined unfairly. Elderly neighbors who had been denied help with property repairs because of arbitrary rules. A couple who had nearly lost their home because the HOA didn't approve their paint color. With each story, my father compiled evidence. He drafted reports. He made calls. He met with council members. By the end of the month, a full investigation into the HOA was underway. By the end of the season, the ruling came down. The HOA was disbanded, its board removed, its funds frozen. Pending an audit, the Land Use Authority returned to the county. The next time my family gathered at my house, we filled the street with laughter. Kids ran across lawns, plates clinked, music played. Not a single patrol car in sight, and my father, sitting in his lawn chair with a glass of iced tea, looked at me and said, "They thought they could push us out, but they forgot who they were dealing with." He didn't mean himself, he meant all of us. Neighbors, families, people, who remembered what it meant to live in a community, not a kingdom run by fear. It didn't take long for word to spread. News of the HOA's sudden collapse rippled through nearby neighborhoods. People who had dealt with their own overreaching HOA boards started reaching out, curious to know what exactly had happened and how. The local paper picked up the story. Not all the details, of course, but enough to stir public interest. A quiet headline read, "Community Judge Helps Dismantle HOA Overreach." But the comments section was on fire. People shared their frustrations, their fears, and more importantly, their hope. What happened in our community wasn't just about one family. It struck a nerve with everyone who had ever felt powerless against a system they couldn't fight. My father received letters, emails, even calls from local news reporters. At first, he declined the interviews. He didn't do it for the attention, he did it because it was right. But when he realized his story could help others, he agreed to it. He spoke plainly, firmly, but with the same integrity I'd seen in him my whole life. He didn't attack anyone personally. He simply explained what had gone wrong, how power had been misused, and how the community had the right to demand better. Meanwhile, the old HOA board members weren't handling their removal well. Ronald Spears, the former president, tried to rally support. He blamed everything on a misunderstanding. He even filed an appeal to reinstate the HOA, but the damage was done. The audit revealed misuse of funds, favoritism in rule enforcement, and a pattern of intimidation tactics. No judge would side with that. The county council appointed a temporary community liaison to oversee what came next. My father was invited to be on the advisory panel. He accepted, but only on the condition that the panel include voices from every background in the community. Single parents, seniors, new homeowners, renters, even young adults. He believed real community meant hearing from everyone. In the months that followed, something beautiful began to happen. The fear that had once blanketed our neighborhood lifted. People started talking again. Not just nodding from across driveways, but really talking, sharing tools, helping each other with projects, swapping gardening tips, hosting little POTLUCKS. My sister, who once left in tears after being stopped by security, returned often. Her kids played with mine again. No one checked her car. No one questioned her presence. A new set of community guidelines was drafted, but this time with full participation from residents. The document wasn't stuffed with vague legal jargon. It was clear, reasonable, and fair. It focused on respect, safety, and cooperation, not control. The security patrols were scaled back and retrained. They weren't there to intimidate anymore, just to be a helpful presence if needed. As all this unfolded, my father stayed mostly quiet. He let the community find its voice. He stepped back just enough to watch others lead, but he was always there if someone had a question or needed advice. One evening, we were walking down the street, just the two of us. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the newly replanted flower beds and freshly painted fences. He paused and looked around. "You see that?" he asked. I nodded. "It looks like a real neighborhood again." He smiled. "That's because it is." There were still challenges, of course. Not everyone agreed on every decision. But now, disagreements led to discussions, not punishments. There was a new culture in place, one of listening and learning, and that made all the difference. As for the old board members, most of them moved away eventually. Rana tried to run for a position on another community board in a nearby area, but his history followed him. Transparency won. People were watching now. My father continued to advise on community matters for a while, but eventually, he said it was time for others to lead. He retired. Again, this time, fully, he spent more time in the garden, reading his favorite books, and watching his grandchildren grow up without fences or fear. I often thought about how quickly everything had changed. How something as simple as a letter could set off a chain reaction that ended with a whole neighborhood reborn. And I realized it wasn't just the letter. It was how someone chose to respond to it, with courage, with clarity, with conviction. Because that's the power of one voice, backed by truth. It doesn't just fight back, it lifts others, it breaks down walls. And sometimes, it even bans fear from the whole county. We still gather as a family, just like before. But now, we do it with open doors, full hearts, and the kind of joy that can only grow where trust lives. And every time we laugh together on the porch or wave to a passing neighbor, I remember what we fought for, not just to visit, but to belong. The town hall's echo hadn't faded when my father started getting emails again. This time, though, they weren't just about our story, they were about ideas. People wanted to rebuild, to learn, to transform what HOA communities could be. Some came from within the state, others came from hundreds of miles away. A woman in Arizona described how her father, a veteran, was fined for flying the American flag. A young couple in Georgia told us they were sued by their HOA for planting vegetables in their front yard. The stories were endless, but the message was clear. People were tired of fear disguised as regulation. My father, despite his years, felt a new kind of purpose. And our family felt it too. We weren't just rebuilding a neighborhood anymore. We were helping inspire a movement. It started small, a few Zoom calls, some quiet advisory roles. But quickly it grew. My father worked with a few retired attorneys and civic leaders to draft a community bill of rights, a simple, digestible guide that residents could use to know their rights and their options. It included things like transparency in board meetings, equal enforcement, freedom from harassment, and limitations on surveillance and fines. It didn't abolish HOAs. It gave power back to the people. They shared it with a handful of communities. Then someone posted it to a forum. Then another shared it to a Facebook group. Within weeks, thousands had downloaded it. And that's when the emails turned into invitations again. Only now, they were from cities, lawmakers, even journalists. Still, my father remained modest. This isn't about me, he'd say, every time we praised him. It's about what people can do when they remember their worth. Meanwhile, back at home, the transformation hadn't stopped. Our once overly monitored street now held laughter again. There were no more warning stickers on mailboxes, no more passive-aggressive signs about lawn length or approved paint colors. Instead, neighbors dropped off pies. Kids ran lemonade stands on weekends. People didn't just live next to each other, they lived with each other. We organized community days, tree planting, cleanup walks, even a porch concert series where local teens played guitar on front steps. The first time it happened, I remember looking at my father and seeing something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Peace. Not the kind that comes from being left alone, but the kind that comes from knowing you've done what you were meant to do. But of course, not everyone was thrilled. There were still a few former board members hanging around. A couple of them were bitter, occasionally muttering in online groups about soft leadership and the chaos of freedom. One even tried to start a petition to reinstate the old rules. It got exactly 7 signatures, 3 of which were from the same household. But no one stopped them, because the new community understood. You don't fight control with control. You fight it with light, and light kept spreading. One day, I received a message from a man named Robert who lived several counties away. He said he had watched his HOA turn from helpful to hostile in less than 2 years. When his teenage daughter parked slightly over the white line in front of their house, they threatened legal action. When his elderly neighbor's porch light burned out and she didn't replace it for 3 days, she was fined. It feels like we're being hunted, he wrote. We're tired, but we're scared to speak. I showed my father the message, and he just nodded. Let's pay them a visit. And we did. We drove out the next weekend, bringing with us a box of printed guides, some coffee, and open ears. What we found was a neighborhood full of people desperate for change but convinced they couldn't achieve it. They'd been told over and over, that's just the way things are. But as we sat in Robert's backyard, under a string of dim patio lights, and shared our story, our struggle, our small victories, our transformation, I saw something shift in them. Shoulders straightened, eyes lit up. It wasn't our advice that changed them. It was permission. Permission to hope again. Within a month, they had organized their first community forum. And soon after, they elected new leadership, people who listened, people who served. Just like that, another corner of the world got brighter. We did this again and again. Each time, we didn't bring answers. We brought questions. What do you want your neighborhood to feel like? What does respect look like to you? What would safety look like if it wasn't attached to fines? Some called it activism. My father called it humanity. But all of this brought something else into focus too. How close we had come to never having any of this. If my father hadn't stood up when he did, if we had given in to fear, our neighborhood might still be a shadow of what it became. And so, might we. That realization stayed with me on a deeper level. I started journaling again, writing down not just what we did but why it mattered. The small moments, the first time a neighbor knocked to borrow a tool instead of filing a complaint, the first community game night. The night a teenage boy played the violin on his stoop and the whole block applauded. These weren't just events, they were reminders of what people are capable of when they're trusted, of what healing looks like when you stop punishing and start listening. And healing, it turned out, was contagious. By the time spring rolled around, our county's commissioner announced a new initiative, Community First. It aimed to evaluate the structure of HOAs across the county, gather input from residents, and offer reform grants to neighborhoods that wanted to make their spaces more inclusive. My father was named an honorary consultant. He laughed when he heard, I was just trying to help my family. He said, now they've got me rewriting policy. He spoke at the launch event, not from a podium, but from a circle of folding chairs, no script, just stories, honest, heartfelt, and real. When he finished, there was no applause, just quiet reflection. And then, one by one, hands went up. Not to question, but to thank him. And then, something else happened. A woman approached us. She was quiet, maybe in her early 30s. She held a folder close to her chest and looked like she wasn't sure whether to speak. My parents live in a neighborhood where the HOA told them their son couldn't visit anymore because of his wheelchair, she said, her voice shaking. They've been too afraid to talk. But I printed this out. She handed my father a copy of the Bill of Rights we'd created. It was covered in sticky notes and highlights. He didn't say much, just held it gently and nodded. But later, in the car, I saw him staring out the window, his fingers still resting on the folder. They're not just pages, he finally said, they're proof. Proof that fear can be replaced, that silence can be broken, that families can be restored. Back at home, life moved at its own gentle rhythm. Our neighborhood had become what I always dreamed it could be. Not perfect, but alive, authentic, connected. We didn't always agree on everything, but we always talked. That, in itself, was a miracle. And every once in a while, we still sat on the porch together, me and my father, the man who reminded a whole town of what dignity looks like. And I'd catch him looking at the street, the houses, the gardens, the kids, and just smiling. Still proud. I'd ask, and he'd nod, quiet as always. Not just proud of what he had done, but proud of what we had all become. One morning, long after the dust had settled and the streets had found peace, I sat with my father on the porch, coffee in hand, both of us watching the sun rise over the rooftops. The neighborhood was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes from calm, not fear. The sidewalks were freshly swept, garden beds were blooming with color. Wind chimes danced gently in the breeze. For the first time in what felt like decades, our community simply breathed. You ever think about how close we came to losing all this? I asked. My father nodded slowly. Every day, he said, but that's what makes it all worth protecting. Life had changed, not just for us, but for people we hadn't even met. The guide we created was being used in counties across the state now. A few communities even began developing their own versions, tailored to their needs. My father insisted on calling it a template, never a rulebook. It's not meant to replace thinking, he'd say. Just remind people they're allowed to. Even the state legislature took notice. A local representative invited my father to consult on a potential bill aimed at limiting overreach in HOA powers, requiring transparency in budgeting, clear appeals processes for residents, and an independent oversight board. He didn't jump into it right away. He asked questions. He took his time, but eventually he gave his support, not for politics, for people. Around that time, my mother pulled me aside. She had watched everything unfold in the background, steady and supportive, though she rarely spoke in public. You know, she said, I think what he did saved more than this street. I think it saved him. And she was right. I'd seen the way my father carried weight over the years, not just legal burdens, but emotional ones. A quiet frustration that came from watching people suffer quietly under rules they couldn't challenge. This gave him something new, not just purpose, peace, a sense that he had done what he was meant to do, helped others discover they could too. But all things change in time. It started with small things. He got tired a little quicker. He stopped going to every community forum, and one night, he told me something I wasn't ready to hear. I think it's time, he said, to let others carry the torch. Yeshua asked. He smiled. The goal was never to be the fire, just to light the first spark. He officially stepped back from public work that spring. A modest farewell dinner was held at the local rec center. It wasn't a grand event, just neighbors, family, and a few people from nearby communities who wanted to say thank you. They brought cards, stories, sometimes even tears. But most of all, they brought gratitude. One man, a former skeptic, stood up and said, when this all started, I thought you were just another angry neighbor, but you taught me what real strength looks like. Not the kind that yells, the kind that listens, and then acts. My father simply nodded. He didn't like praise, but in that moment, I saw a tear slip down his cheek. After that, life slowed down. In the best way, he spent mornings in the garden, tending to vegetables and trimming the roses my mother loved. Kids would come by to ask for stories. Teenagers would stop in to ask for advice on law school or civic work. He never turned anyone away. He just kept doing what he always did, helping, quietly, humbly, consistently. And even though he had left the spotlight, his influence never faded. New neighborhood leaders rose up, people who had watched, learned, and led with integrity. The community association was no longer feared. It was trusted. Instead of meetings behind closed doors, there were open discussions under the community oak tree. People weren't just surviving their HOA anymore. They were shaping it. And as the years passed, other neighborhoods followed suit. Cities even began incorporating parts of the Community Bill of Rights into their own municipal codes. We never sought fame, but the impact echoed further than we ever imagined. but even stories with hope have their goodbyes. One fall afternoon, I found my father sitting on the porch in his usual chair, blanket draped across his knees, a journal in his hand. He looked out over the yard for a long time before speaking. "You know," he said softly, "this porch used to feel like a cage. Now it feels like a monument." "To what?" I asked. "To what happens when people stop being afraid." He passed in his sleep that winter, peacefully, without pain. The way a man should leave who spent his life lifting others. The neighborhood held a candlelight walk in his honor. Hundreds came, neighbors, officials, strangers who had read his words and felt changed. They didn't speak much, just walked, quietly, past the houses he helped free, past the flowers he helped plant, past the gates he helped open. And on the steps of our porch, someone left a small plaque. No name, no title, just one simple line. He reminded us we could. That plaque still sits there today. Weathered now, but untouched. Every child who learns to ride a bike down the sidewalk sees it. Every couple who walks hand in hand past our yard reads it. And every new neighbor who moves in asks, "What does it mean?" And we tell them that. We tell them the story of the HOA that tried to divide a family, and the man who reunited a community. We'll tell them about how fear used to live here but doesn't anymore. About how change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, grows, blooms. Because community isn't built by power. It's built by presence. And that's the legacy my father left behind. Not rules, not orders, but a way forward. So when people ask me if I ever feared the HOA, I tell them the truth. We did once, but not anymore, because we remembered who we were, and that made all the difference. Now, every spring, we plant a new tree by the community garden. We call it the legacy tree. Each one represents another year of freedom, kindness, and connection. The kids decorate them with ribbons and messages. The adults gather nearby and share memories. And every time we do, someone says, "Imagine what would have happened if no one had spoken up." But we don't have to imagine, because someone did. And now, we all do. This place, this street, this neighborhood, this little corner of the world, it's more than just where we live. It's proof that courage spreads, that respect grows, that families matter, and that sometimes one letter, one stand, one voice can ban fear from an entire county. Forever.